President Roosevelt called it a date that would live in infamy. At 7:48 in the morning Hawaiian time on December 7th, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor like a thunderclap from a clear sky. Within 2 hours, the Empire of Japan had turned the United States Pacific Fleet into a burning graveyard. 8 battleships damaged for sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans lost their lives. 1,178 wounded. The attack wasn't just an assault on military installations. It was a declaration that the world had changed forever and America would have to change with it. The next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. Within 72 hours, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, pulling the nation into a global conflict on 2 fronts. Suddenly, America faced the most massive military mobilization in its history. The scale was staggering. The Army needed to expand from fewer than 200,000 troops to millions within months. The Navy was facing a dire shortage of manpower as ships needed crews and shore installations needed operators. Every branch of the military was scrambling for personnel. But there was a problem. A massive, unavoidable problem. There simply weren't enough men. The draft was pulling young men from factories, farms, and offices at breakneck speed. But even with universal conscription, the numbers just didn't add up. The military needed bodies for combat roles, yes, but it also needed thousands upon thousands of people to handle logistics, communications, administration, maintenance, and medical care. For every soldier in the field, multiple support personnel were required back home and in rear areas. In military planning offices across Washington, strategists confronted what you might call an uncomfortable truth. Traditional thinking said these support roles had to be filled by men. But traditional thinking wasn't going to win this war. General George Catlett Marshall, Army Chief of Staff and one of the most respected military minds of his generation, saw what others refused to acknowledge. Half the population had been systematically excluded from military service. Half the talent pool had never been tapped. And in total war, that was a luxury America could no longer afford. Marshall wasn't alone in this recognition. Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers of Massachusetts had been thinking about this issue since 1941, long before Pearl Harbor. Rogers had served with the American Red Cross in France during World War I. She'd seen firsthand what women could contribute to a war effort. More importantly, she'd seen how American women who served overseas in that conflict returned home with no recognition, no benefits, and no official status. Imagine that for a moment, serving your country in a conflict zone only to return home and be treated as if you were never there. Rogers believed that if women were going to serve in this new war, they must have official military status and protection. By May of 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, Rogers had introduced House Resolution 4906 to establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. The bill went precisely nowhere. It sat in the House Rules Committee, gathering dust. Congressmen dismissed the very idea as absurd, unnecessary, or downright unpatriotic. Who would do the cooking and washing and mending if women went into the Army? They asked. What would happen to the American home? Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly the absurd became essential. General Marshall shook his finger at Colonel John Hildriving of his general staff and declared he wanted a women's corps right away, and he didn't want any excuses. The Bureau of the Budget, which had been insisting there would never be a manpower shortage, withdrew its objections 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Even the most stubborn opponents in Congress couldn't publicly reject the Chief of Staff's assessment, not when American ships still smoldered in Hawaii and war had been declared. But this wasn't going to be easy. The compromise that emerged reflected deep ambivalence about women in uniform. The proposed Women's Army Auxiliary Corps would be with the Army, not of the Army. And that distinction? It meant everything. Women would serve, yes, but they wouldn't technically be soldiers. They'd have rank-like designations, but not real military rank. They'd wear uniforms and follow orders, but they wouldn't receive military medical care, life insurance, or veterans' benefits. A first officer in the WAC would do the work of an Army captain, but receive the pay of a lieutenant. The director would eventually command over 100,000 women, but earn $3,000 a year, the same as a major, while lieutenant generals commanding similar numbers earned 8,000. It was insulting. It was inadequate. And it was the best deal they were going to get. For now, on May 14th, 1942, exactly 5 months and 7 days after Pearl Harbor, Congress approved the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. President Roosevelt signed the bill into law. The WAC was real. Now someone had to make it work. The slogan was simple, catchy, and calculated to defuse opposition. Free a man to fight. The idea was that women would take over non-combat jobs on military bases, in offices, and in support roles, thereby releasing men for combat duty overseas. Framed this way, women's service wasn't about equality or opportunity. It was about practicality and patriotism. It was about winning the war. General Marshall understood the politics perfectly. In his correspondence to Congress, he emphasized that women must be employed in the overall effort, that their status and relationship to military authority needed to be clearly established, and that their service was essential to complete mobilization. He pointed out that the Army's telephone service had always had a reputation for being terrible despite superior equipment, and that women operators could and did fix that problem immediately. Why waste time training men in specialties like typing or telephone work that in civilian life had been completely taken over by women, he argued. It was uneconomical, and more importantly, it was a waste of time the nation didn't have. Colonel Hildriving later explained Marshall's thinking in starker terms. The Chief of Staff foresaw a cycle of shortages. The immediate shortage was supplies, but Marshall became convinced that the future bottleneck would be manpower. And this is a detail that, when you stop to think about it, changes everything. War had become a complicated business requiring many civilian techniques, and many of those techniques were almost completely controlled by women in civilian society. Marshall also noted, perhaps most tellingly, that the ladies wanted in, and he had a passionate regard for democratic ideals. But passionate regard for democratic ideals didn't mean the road would be smooth. Opposition remained fierce from multiple directions. In Congress, representatives rose to declare that taking women into the armed services would destroy American womanhood and undermine the sanctity of home and family. Some asked, with genuine bewilderment, think of the humiliation. What has become of the manhood of America? The debate revealed deep anxieties about gender roles, masculinity, and social order. Within the military itself, resistance was even more entrenched. Many commanders simply resented the idea of women doing military jobs. Male soldiers shared this misogyny, and as the WAC began to form, vicious rumor campaigns emerged. Women in uniform were accused of immorality, promiscuity, and behavior unbecoming. These slander campaigns would have devastating effects on recruitment and morale in the months to come. And in broader American society, the very concept challenged fundamental assumptions about femininity and women's proper place. Women were supposed to be mothers, wives, homemakers. They were supposed to nurture, not organize logistics for war. They were supposed to be soft, delicate, decorative. The military was hard, rough, masculine. It's a clash of ideas that, for many people at the time, was simply unthinkable. How could these two worlds possibly coexist? Yet there were powerful voices pushing back. Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady and perhaps the most influential woman in America, became a vocal advocate for women in military service. She used her platform, her newspaper column, My Day, her radio addresses, and her personal influence with the president to argue that women had vital roles to play. When she visited England in October 1942 and saw British women serving in every capacity to support their country, she was deeply impressed and determined that American women should have the same opportunities. She believed that the effort to win the war could erase lines of social class and create new values, just as it had in Britain. Roosevelt wasn't just talking about middle-class white women either. She pushed for the inclusion of African American women in the WAC, though she faced enormous resistance on this front as well. The military was still segregated by law and by practice. Just stop and consider that for a moment. Opening it to white women was controversial enough. Opening it to black women was, to many in power, unthinkable. But Roosevelt persisted. Dr. Margaret Chung, Chinese-American physician and advocate, also worked tirelessly to advance women's military service, particularly in the Navy, where she played a crucial role in creating the WAVES program. Women's advocacy groups, professional organizations, and civic leaders across the country added their voices. The message was clear. This wasn't just the military's war or the government's war. It was everybody's war. Women had to be part of it, not just on the home front rolling bandages and buying war bonds, but in uniform, in official capacity, with real responsibilities. Now came the hard part, making it happen. Oveta Culpabi was not an obvious choice to lead a military revolution. Born January 19, 1905, in Killeen, Texas, she was the daughter of a lawyer and politician. She'd been an extraordinary student, attending Mary Hardin Baylor College for Women and then the University of Texas Law School. By age 20, she was Houston's assistant city attorney and the parliamentarian of the Texas legislature, an expert in formal procedures used by legislative bodies. In 1931, she married William Hobby, former governor of Texas and publisher of the Houston Post newspaper. She went to work at the Post, starting as book editor and climbing to executive vice president. Between 1933 and 1941, Hobby was remarkably productive. She worked as parliamentarian for the Texas legislature, helped her husband manage the Post, served as president of the Texas League of Women Voters, raised 2 children, and even wrote a book on parliamentary practice called Mr. Chairman, published in 1936. This was a woman who knew how to organize, how to lead, and how to navigate complex political terrain. And she would need every single one of those skills for what came next. On May 14, 1942, the same day Congress approved the WAC, General Marshall asked Hobby to become its first director. 2 days later, on May 16th, she was officially appointed. She accepted immediately, embracing the challenge with dedication and energy. Hobby believed passionately in what the WAC could accomplish. She also understood the enormous obstacles ahead. The first challenge was simply creating an organization from nothing. There were no facilities, no training manuals, no uniforms, no established procedures. Everything had to be built from scratch, and it had to be built fast. The military needed these women yesterday. Fort Des Moines, Iowa, was selected as the WAC training center. The first officer candidate class arrived in July 1942, just 2 months after the WAC was created. 440 women from every corner of the country converged on Iowa to begin training. They were teachers, secretaries, business owners, artists, lawyers. They were young and middle-aged. They were single, married, and widowed. They were white and black, though strictly segregated. What they had in common was a determination to serve. The training was intense. Physical conditioning, military protocol, administration, leadership. The women learned to march in formation, to salute, to follow orders and give them. They studied army regulations, military structure, and the specialized skills they'd need for their assigned jobs. The first officer candidates graduated in August 1942, becoming the leadership cadre for the enlisted women who would follow. Hobby set exacting standards. She insisted that WACS be professional, disciplined, and above reproach in every way. She knew that her women would be scrutinized far more harshly than any male soldier, that every mistake would be magnified, and that the success or failure of the entire experiment rested on their performance. The pressure was enormous. Recruitment was initially encouraging. In the first year, 35,000 women applied to join the WAC. This was a remarkable response, suggesting that despite societal resistance, thousands of American women were eager for the opportunity to serve in uniform. Applications came from all regions, all backgrounds, all walks of life. But then disaster struck. In the summer of 1943, a vicious slander campaign began circulating about WAC members. Rumors spread that 90% of WACs were prostitutes, that they were being issued contraceptives, that they were sexually promiscuous and morally corrupt. These lies were repeated in newspapers, in gossip, and even from some pulpits. They were completely false, but they were devastatingly effective. Applications plummeted. Families forbade daughters from joining. Women already serving faced harassment and suspicion when they returned home on leave. It's difficult to overstate how damaging this was. Hobby and her supporters were outraged, but the damage was done. The War Department launched investigations and issued official denials, but changing public perception was far harder than spreading lies in the first place. In the midst of this crisis, something crucial happened. In July 1943, Congress passed legislation converting the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps into the Women's Army Corps. The distinction was everything. WACs had been with the Army. WACs would be of the Army, actual soldiers with full military status. When a WAC re-enlisted to become a WAC, she finally received the same pay, the same benefits and privileges, and was subject to the same disciplinary code as male soldiers. The only positions WACs couldn't accept were those labeled combat. On July 1, 1943, Oveta Kulpabi was commissioned as a colonel in the United States Army, the first female commanding officer in Army history. It was a recognition of her service and leadership, but her rank was still limited. She commanded over 100,000 women by the end of the war, yet remained a colonel while male officers commanding equivalent numbers were lieutenant generals or higher. Hobby served as WAC director until July 1945, just weeks after victory in Europe and weeks before victory over Japan. In January 1945, she received the Distinguished Service Medal for outstanding service to her country during World War II, becoming one of the first women to receive this high military honor. Her leadership had been instrumental in transforming a controversial experiment into an established institution. By the war's end, approximately 150,000 women had served in the WAC and WAC. They worked in over 200 different job classifications. They served in every theater of the war. They proved, beyond any possible doubt, that women could perform military work with efficiency, skill, spirit, and determination. The Army wasn't the only branch facing manpower shortages. The Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard all confronted the same mathematics: too many jobs, not enough men. And if the Army could swallow its pride and accept women, they could too. The Navy actually had advantages the Army lacked. Because naval regulations required that only men could serve aboard ships, and the Navy had no intention of changing that rule, women could only serve in shore installations on the home front. This made their service less threatening to tradition and easier to sell to skeptics. If women stayed safely on land while men went to sea, the natural order seemed preserved. On July 21, 1942, just 2 months after the WAC was created, Congress passed legislation establishing WAVs, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. President Roosevelt signed it into law 8 days later. The creation of WAVs was due largely to the unrelenting efforts of the Navy's Women's Advisory Council, Dr. Margaret Chung, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Captain Mildred McAfee was appointed director of WAVs. McAfee was president of Wellesley College, one of the premier women's educational institutions in the country. She brought academic prestige and organizational expertise to the role. Under her leadership, WAVs developed a reputation for professionalism and high standards. Hunter College in the Bronx, New York, was designated as the primary WAVs training facility. The college was commissioned as USS Hunter, turning an academic campus into a naval installation. Thousands of women passed through Hunter College for basic training, then went on to specialized schools to learn radio operation, aviation mechanics, navigation, cryptography, and countless other skills. The Navy made one crucial decision differently than the Army. And this, right here, is a crucial distinction. From the beginning, WAVs had full military status, not auxiliary status. They received the same pay and benefits as male sailors of equivalent rank. This gave the Navy an immediate advantage in recruitment and morale. Congress made clear, however, that WAVs inclusion was purely a wartime emergency measure. The law stipulated that WAVs could only serve for the duration of the war plus 6 months, and only in the continental United States and Hawaii. They weren't permitted to board naval ships or combat aircraft, and they had no command authority except within the women's branch. But compared to the WAC's initial status, this was generous. By the end of World War II, approximately 100,000 women had served in WAVs. They worked as aviation mechanics, parachute riggers, control tower operators, celestial navigation trainers, link trainer instructors teaching pilots to fly, meteorologists, cryptographers, and radio operators. They served at naval air stations, training facilities, hospitals, and administrative centers across the country. Their service freed tens of thousands of sailors for sea duty. The Coast Guard followed suit in November 1942, establishing SPARS, named after the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. Lieutenant Dorothy Stratton was appointed director. SPARS trained at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, and at other facilities. Approximately 13,000 women served in SPARS during the war. They worked in communications, administrative roles, and various technical positions, supporting Coast Guard operations on the home front. The Marine Corps, arguably the most tradition-bound and masculine branch of the military, held out longest. But even the Marines couldn't escape the manpower crisis. In February 1943, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve was established. Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Cheney Streeter became director. Marines trained at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and at other facilities. The Marine Corps took a slightly different approach. And what they did was subtle, but important. They didn't give their women a separate acronym like WAC or WAVs. They were simply Marines. Their WM's Women Marines, Commandant Thomas Holcomb said, but also emphasized that they were Marines first. This semantic choice reflected both pride and ambivalence. Women could be Marines, but they were still women Marines, a category apart. Approximately 23,000 women served in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve during World War II. They worked as mechanics, parachute riggers, radio operators, munitions handlers, and in countless other specialties. Marine Corps leadership was initially skeptical, but became convinced of the women Marines' value relatively quickly. General Commandant Holcomb wrote that the work of the women reservists makes it possible to release enough men for combat duty to form 3 new Marine divisions. Just pause and think about that impact. 3. New Marine divisions. That was force multiplication that couldn't be ignored. Each branch developed its own culture, its own training programs, its own relationship between male and female service members. But they all confronted similar challenges: overcoming prejudice, proving competence, maintaining morale in the face of hostility, and contributing meaningfully to the war effort while being excluded from the very combat roles that defined military prestige. Women in all these services faced discrimination in pay initially, particularly in the WAC before it became WAC. They faced sexual harassment, though that term didn't exist yet. They faced constant scrutiny of their appearance, their morals, their femininity. Imagine the psychological pressure. They were told simultaneously to be tough enough to do men's work and feminine enough to remain proper ladies. The contradictions were exhausting, yet they persevered. By mid-war, the women's military services were established facts of American life. Recruiting posters showed women in crisp uniforms, projecting confidence and patriotism. Newsreels featured women marching in formation, working on aircraft engines, operating radio equipment. What had been unthinkable in 1941 was routine by 1944. But so far, we've largely been talking about jobs on the ground. Flying was different. Flying was glamorous, prestigious, and undeniably combat adjacent. Pilots were warriors, even if they never fired a shot. The idea of women flying military aircraft pushed boundaries in ways that clerical work or even cryptography never could. 2 women had visions for how American women could serve as pilots during World War II. They were both brilliant, accomplished, determined, and they couldn't stand each other. Jacqueline Cochran was already one of the most famous aviators in the world when the war began. She held multiple speed records, had won the prestigious Bendix Trophy, and was a successful businesswoman running her own cosmetics company. She was bold, ambitious, politically connected, and utterly convinced she knew how women pilots could best serve their country. Nancy Harkness Love was equally accomplished, if less flashy. She'd been flying since age 16, had worked as a test pilot, and had extensive experience in aviation operations. She was practical, detail-oriented, and deeply committed to getting women into the cockpits of military aircraft as quickly as possible. In September 1942, Nancy Love convinced the Air Transport Command to create the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WFS. The concept was straightforward. Experienced women pilots, already highly qualified, would ferry military aircraft from factories to air bases, freeing male pilots for combat duty. 20 women were initially recruited, all with significant flying experience, commercial licenses, and at least 500 hours of flight time. They began operations immediately. Cochran was furious. She'd been working on her own proposal for a much larger women's aviation program. She envisioned training hundreds of women pilots from scratch, creating a comprehensive training pipeline that would feed the military's needs for pilots over the long term. Love's WFS, with its high entry requirements and small numbers, seemed to Cochran like a half measure that would undermine her bigger vision. The conflict escalated. Both women had powerful supporters in the military hierarchy. Love had the backing of the Air Transport Command. Cochran had General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, in her corner. Arnold wanted a large-scale training program, and he wanted Cochran to run it. In July 1943, the Women's Flying Training Detachment, which Cochrane had established at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, merged with Love's WFS. The new organization was called Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP. Jacqueline Cochrane became director of women pilots. Nancy Love retained a leadership role, but was effectively subordinate to Cochrane. The merger resolved the administrative conflict, but didn't heal the personal rift. Avenger Field, Texas, became the only all-female flight training facility in American history. Women from across the country came to this dusty airfield in West Texas to learn to fly military aircraft. The training was rigorous, equivalent to what male cadets received. They learned to fly primary trainers, basic trainers, advanced trainers, and then transitioned to the frontline aircraft they'd actually be flying: fighters, bombers, transport planes. The washout rate was high. Flying is dangerous, and military flying is more dangerous still. Some women couldn't handle the physical demands. Others struggled with the academics or the stress. But those who made it through became some of the most skilled pilots in the country. 1,074 women trained and graduated from the WASP program. They came from every state. They were from diverse backgrounds. Some were wealthy, some working class. Some had college degrees, others had barely finished high school. What united them was a passion for flying and a determination to serve. The WASP missions were far more diverse and dangerous than the public understood. Yes, they ferried aircraft, delivering planes from factories to air bases. But that was just the beginning. WASPs flew every type of aircraft the Army Air Forces operated. Fighters, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings. Bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, and the massive B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced and complex bomber in the world. Transport aircraft, liaison planes, training planes. If the Army Air Forces flew it, WASPs flew it. They flew target toning missions, pulling aerial targets behind their planes so anti-aircraft gunners could practice shooting. Now, just try to picture that. This was extraordinarily dangerous. They were literally flying in front of people shooting at them, trusting that the gunner's aim was good enough to hit the target and not the plane. Sometimes the gunner's aim wasn't good enough. They flew test flights on repaired aircraft, taking planes up for the first time after maintenance to make sure everything worked properly. Again, this was high-risk duty. If repairs had been done incorrectly, the test pilot was the one who'd find out, often at altitude with limited options for survival. They served as engineering test pilots, evaluating aircraft performance and new equipment. They trained male pilots, demonstrating aircraft capabilities and instructing in-flight techniques. They flew simulated strafing and dive bombing missions to train ground troops to recognize aircraft and respond to air attacks. In total, WASPs flew over 60 million miles during World War II. 60 million miles. The scale is almost incomprehensible. They delivered over 12,000 aircraft of 78 different types. They logged nearly every kind of flying mission short of actual combat. And they did it without military status. Unlike the WAC, WAVES, SPARS, and Women Marines, WASPs were never granted official military standing during the war. They were civil service employees under military direction. This meant they received no military benefits, no medical care if injured, no death benefits if killed. And what happened when they did give their lives? The answer is heartbreaking. When a WASP died in service, her family had to pay to ship her body home. Her fellow pilots would sometimes take up a collection to help cover the cost. 38 WASPs died during their service. 38 women who volunteered, who trained, who flew dangerous missions, who gave their lives. One was declared missing and never found. They died in crashes, in mechanical failures, in weather, in all the ways pilots die when pushing the edge of what's possible. And Baumgartner became the first American woman to fly a jet aircraft when she tested the Bell-White P-59A in October 1944. WASP's Betty Gillies and Nancy Love were the first women to fly the B-17 Flying Fortress. Dora Doherty and Dorothea Johnson were the first women to fly the B-29 Super Fortress, demonstrating to skeptical male pilots that the massive bomber wasn't as difficult to handle as they claimed. General Hap Arnold praised the WASPs publicly and repeatedly. In his final report on the WASP program, he wrote that their service proved that women could fly military aircraft as effectively as men, and that they had released male pilots for combat duty. But when Cochrane pushed for the WASPs to be granted official military status in 1944, Congress refused. The opposition was fierce and sometimes bizarre. Some congressmen argued that there were already enough pilots and no need to militarize women flyers. Some claimed that giving women military status would take jobs from men returning from combat. Some simply opposed women in uniform on principle. In December 1944, Congress voted down legislation that would have made WASPs part of the Army Air Forces. Without military status, the program couldn't continue after the war. On December 20th, 1944, the WASP program was officially disbanded. So, what was the reward for flying 60 million miles? Over 1,000 women pilots returned to civilian life with no benefits, no recognition, and officially, no military service. For 33 years, WASPs fought for recognition. They lobbied Congress, wrote letters, organized reunions, kept their story alive. Finally, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed legislation granting WASPs retroactive veteran status. It was a victory, but it came too late for many who had already died. In 2009, 65 years after the program ended, Congress awarded the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. Hundreds of surviving WASPs, many in their 80s and 90s, gathered in Washington for the ceremony. They stood in the Capitol Rotunda, wearing their WASP uniforms or insignia, finally receiving the recognition they'd earned decades earlier. The medals couldn't bring back the 38 who died. They couldn't erase the decades of struggle for basic recognition. But they represented a nation finally, belatedly, acknowledging that these women had served, had sacrificed, and had helped win the war. Long before the WAC, WAVES, SPARS, Women Marines, or WASPs existed, military nurses had been serving in war zones. The Army Nurse Corps was established in 1901. The Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. Nurses were the exception to the rule that women didn't serve in the military, and World War II would prove just how vital that exception was. 68,000 nurses served in the Army and Navy during World War II, 57,000 in the Army Nurse Corps, 11,000 in the Navy Nurse Corps. They served wherever American forces fought: North Africa, Europe, the Pacific, China-Burma-India Theater, Alaska, the Mediterranean. They served on hospital ships, in field hospitals close to combat, in evacuation hospitals, in general hospitals far behind the lines. The work was brutal. They worked 12-hour shifts that often stretched to 16 or 18 hours when casualties poured in. They worked in tents, in bombed-out buildings, in jungle clearings, in conditions that would have shut down any civilian hospital immediately. And when you hear "under fire," that is not an exaggeration. They worked under fire, under bombing raids, under the constant stress of knowing that the next wave of wounded could arrive at any moment. The medical care in World War II represented a revolution in military medicine. For the first time in history, a wounded soldier had a better than even chance of surviving. Antibiotics, particularly penicillin, transformed infection from a death sentence to a treatable condition. Blood transfusions, plasma, improved surgical techniques, better understanding of shock and trauma, rapid evacuation from battlefield to field hospital to evacuation hospital. All these advances saved lives. But technology alone didn't save soldiers. Nurses did. They administered the penicillin, hung the plasma, monitored the vital signs, cleaned the wounds, changed the bandages, held the hands, wrote the letters home, fought against death with every tool and every ounce of strength they had. Nurses landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day +4, 4 days after the initial invasion. They waded through surf, climbed over obstacles, and set up field hospitals within range of German artillery. They worked in the freezing cold of the Battle of the Bulge, in the crushing heat of the Pacific Islands, in the monsoon rains of Burma. They served in the China-Burma-India theater, one of the most challenging environments of the war, where disease killed more soldiers than combat. They served in North Africa, where the army learned hard lessons about desert warfare and nurses learned to treat casualties in sandstorms. They served in Italy, crawling up the peninsula mile by bloody mile. They served in the Pacific island hopping campaigns, where every island meant another invasion, another battle, another wave of shattered bodies. This was the reality of the Nurse Corps, and the cost was high. 16 nurses were killed by enemy fire during World War II. 16 women who went to save lives and lost their own. They died in bombing raids, in ship sinkings, in plane crashes, in the random terrible luck of war. Hundreds more were wounded. 1,600 nurses received decorations for bravery and meritorious service. They received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Distinguished Flying Crosses, Purple Hearts, Legion of Merit Awards. They received commendations from commanding generals who credited them with saving countless lives and maintaining morale under impossible conditions. The mortality rate for wounded American soldiers in World War II was dramatically lower than in any previous war. If a wounded soldier reached a field hospital alive, he had an excellent chance of survival. Much of that remarkable achievement was due to the skill, dedication, and courage of military nurses. Some nurses didn't just work near combat zones. They were captured by the enemy, imprisoned, and forced to provide medical care under conditions of challenging captivity. Ruby Bradley was serving at Camp John Hay in the Philippines when Japan attacked in December 1941. She and other medical personnel were taken prisoner and held in Japanese internment camps for 3 years. In captivity, Bradley continued to practice nursing under unimaginable conditions. She performed 230 surgeries with inadequate instruments and no anesthesia. She delivered 13 babies in the camp. She secretly kept food from her own meager rations and gave it to children in the camp, losing her weight to dangerous levels to keep others alive. Think about that for a second. She was starving herself, quite literally, to keep children alive. When American forces liberated the camp in February 1945, Bradley weighed only 84 pounds. She nearly starved herself saving others. After the war, she remained in the army, served in the Korean War, where she was credited with saving the lives of more than 200 wounded soldiers, and retired as a colonel. She became one of the most decorated women in American military history. Ruby Bradley's story was extraordinary, but she wasn't alone. 88 American military women were taken prisoner by Japanese forces during World War II. Most were nurses captured in the Philippines when American and Filipino forces surrendered after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. These women endured years of imprisonment under conditions that violated every standard of the Geneva Conventions. They were malnourished, housed in overcrowded camps, denied adequate medical supplies, and subject to the arbitrary cruelty of their captors. Yet they continued to provide medical care to other prisoners, maintained discipline and organization, and supported each other through the ordeal. When liberation finally came in early 1945, the released prisoners returned home to a nation that struggled to understand what they'd endured. And this is a part of the story you may not have considered. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized as a diagnosis yet. Women especially were expected to simply move on, to return to normal life, to not dwell on unpleasant experiences. Many of these former prisoners struggled for decades with nightmares, survivor's guilt, and the psychological wounds of captivity. Military nurses in World War II proved beyond any argument that women could serve in war zones, could handle horrific stress, could perform under fire, and could make life-or-death decisions with the same competence and courage as men. They earned the respect of the soldiers they treated and the commanders they served. They also paid a price: physical exhaustion, psychological trauma, and, for 88 women, years stolen away in captivity. When General Marshall talked about freeing men for combat, skeptics assumed women would only do clerical work, typing letters, filing papers, answering phones. But what if I told you that was just the cover story? The reality was far more complex and far more impressive. Women in uniform during World War II held over 200 different job classifications, 200 distinct specialties, from the mundane to the highly technical, from the routine to the critically important. Yes, some women were typists and file clerks. Administrative work had to be done, and women did it efficiently. But that was just the beginning. Women worked as cryptographers, breaking enemy codes and protecting American communications. They worked in the Signal Intelligence Service, the precursor to the National Security Agency, where they decrypted Japanese and German messages. Much of this work remained classified for decades after the war, so the public had no idea of the critical intelligence role women had played. Women worked as photo analysts, studying reconnaissance photographs to identify enemy positions, track troop movements, and assess bomb damage. They worked as weather forecasters, providing crucial meteorological data for flight operations and tactical planning. They worked as air traffic controllers, managing the complex flow of aircraft at busy military airfields. Women worked as aircraft mechanics, maintaining and repairing the planes that pilots flew into combat. They worked as parachute riggers, packing parachutes with meticulous care because lives depended on every fold being perfect. They worked as sheet metal workers, electricians, radio technicians, and other skilled trades. Women worked as gunner instructors, teaching male soldiers how to operate anti-aircraft weapons. They worked as link trainer instructors, using flight simulators to train pilots. They worked as control tower operators, guiding aircraft through takeoffs and landings. Women worked in ordnance, handling ammunition and explosives. They worked in motor pools, maintaining and driving military vehicles. They worked in supply depots, managing the complex logistics that kept armies functioning. Some of these jobs required extensive training. Women attended specialized schools lasting weeks or months, studying technical subjects, mastering complex equipment, passing rigorous examinations. The military quickly learned that women could handle technical education as well as men, and often with better results. The diversity of women's service exploded the myth that they could only do women's work. They were doing work that had been exclusively male for generations, and in many cases, they were doing it better. Studies showed that women learned Morse code faster than men. They made fewer errors in repetitive tasks requiring precision. They were more reliable in administrative positions and showed lower absence rates. This wasn't because women were inherently superior to men. It was because, for the first time, Women were being given real opportunities, real training, and real responsibilities. When given the chance, they demonstrated capabilities that social convention had always denied existed. The stereotypes about women's limitations were crumbling under the weight of evidence. Women could handle stress. They could master technology. They could lead. They could perform under pressure. They could do the job. The ultimate test of the women's services came with the planning and execution of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, was a practical man focused on winning the war. He didn't care about social conventions or gender politics. He cared about whether his forces had the personnel, equipment, and logistics needed for the most massive and complex amphibious invasion in history. WASP served in every aspect of the invasion planning. They worked in communications, ensuring that headquarters could coordinate with far-flung units. They worked in intelligence, analyzing information about German defenses. They worked in logistics, tracking the mountains of supplies needed to land and sustain armies in France. They worked in administration, handling the endless paperwork that modern warfare generated. Eisenhower called women's service sine qua non of the invasion effort. Now, you might hear that and just move on, but sine qua non is a Latin phrase that means without which, not. Essential, indispensable, not helpful, not useful, absolutely necessary. That was the highest praise a military commander could give. Eisenhower was saying that the invasion could not have succeeded without women's contributions. After D-Day, WASP landed in France and moved forward with the advancing armies. They served in communications, headquarters, medical units, and support roles as Allied forces fought across France, into Germany, and finally to victory. In the Pacific theater, women's service was equally critical. The vast distances, the island-hopping campaigns, the complex logistics of projecting force across the world's largest ocean, all of this required enormous administrative and technical support. 565 WASPs served in the Pacific theater and received combat decorations for service under fire. They were bombed by Japanese aircraft, worked in combat zones, and faced many of the same dangers as male soldiers. The force multiplication effect was real and measurable. Every woman who took a support role freed a man for combat duty. With over 350,000 women in uniform by war's end, that meant 350,000 additional men in combat roles. Let that number sink in for a moment. Marine Commandant Holcomb's calculation that women Marines freed enough men to form 3 new divisions wasn't hyperbole. Similar calculations applied across all services. But the impact went beyond simple math. Women brought skills, dedication, and perspectives that enhanced military operations in ways that couldn't be quantified. They improved morale. They increased efficiency. They demonstrated professionalism that raised standards across units. General Douglas MacArthur, initially skeptical of women in the military, became a strong supporter after seeing WASPs perform in the Pacific. He requested more WASPs for his command and praised their performance publicly. General George Patton, hardly known for progressive views on gender, acknowledged that women in support roles were essential to keeping his armored divisions moving. The evidence was overwhelming. The experiment had worked. Women could serve in the military effectively, and the United States military was stronger for their presence. Wearing the uniform didn't mean acceptance. Women in military service during World War II faced hostility, harassment, and discrimination from multiple directions. The slander campaign against the WASP in the summer of 1943 was the most visible and damaging manifestation of this hostility. Rumors circulated that 90% of WACs were prostitutes, that they were promiscuous, that the military was issuing them contraceptives, that they'd abandon morality and decency. These lies were cruel, false, and devastatingly effective. The sources of these rumors were sometimes traceable to men who resented women's presence in the military. Some came from religious leaders who believed women in uniform violated natural law. Some came from family members threatened by daughters, wives, or sisters asserting independence. And some came from simple misogyny, the reflexive hatred of women who stepped outside traditional boundaries. The War Department investigated thoroughly and found the rumors completely baseless. The rates of pregnancy and venereal disease among WACs were far lower than among civilian women of comparable age. Standards of conduct were strictly enforced. Women who violated regulations faced discharge. The truth didn't matter. The damage was done. Applications to join the WAC dropped precipitously after the slander campaign. Women who were already serving faced humiliation when they went home on leave. Families discouraged daughters from joining. Communities whispered. The unfairness was staggering. These women were volunteering to serve their country, and they were being accused of immorality for doing so. It's a level of unfairness that is difficult to fully comprehend today. Even without organized slander, daily sexism was pervasive. Male soldiers made crude jokes. Commanders expressed doubts about women's capabilities. Regulations treated women differently, often more restrictively, than men. Women had to follow stricter rules about conduct, appearance, and off-duty activities. The military's response to prejudice was often to emphasize femininity rather than challenge sexism directly. Women in uniform were told they must remain feminine, must pay attention to appearance, must not become mannish. Uniforms were designed to be flattering as well as functional. Women were encouraged to wear makeup, maintain hairstyles, and project traditional femininity even while doing non-traditional work. This femininity campaign was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it may have reduced some opposition by reassuring nervous observers that women in uniform weren't abandoning their gender. On the other hand, it reinforced the idea that women's primary value was appearance, not competence. And it placed an extra burden on servicewomen who had to be tough enough to do demanding work yet feminine enough to satisfy social expectations. Think about that impossible balancing act for a moment. Pay inequality was another form of discrimination, especially early in the war. WAC officers earned less than male officers of equivalent responsibility. The director of the WAC commanded over 100,000 women, but earned less than a major, while male officers commanding similar numbers were generals. When the WAC became the WAC in July 1943, pay equity was finally achieved, but the initial disparity was insulting. Women were also denied benefits that male soldiers received automatically. Initially, WACs didn't receive military medical care, life insurance, or veterans benefits. Their service was officially auxiliary, not military, which meant they served with all the responsibilities but few of the protections. This changed with conversion to WAC status, but for over a year, thousands of women served without basic support. The WASPs faced perhaps the most egregious discrimination regarding status and benefits. They flew the same planes, faced the same dangers, performed the same missions as male pilots, but never received military status during the war. When a WASP died, her family had to pay to ship her body home. She had no military funeral, no flag on her coffin, no official recognition of her sacrifice. It took 33 years of lobbying before WASPs received veteran status in 1977. The contradiction was stark. Women were asked to serve, to sacrifice, to take on responsibilities and risks, but they were denied equal status, equal pay, equal recognition. They were essential to victory yet treated as supplementary. They were praised in public yet discriminated against in policy. African American women who wanted to serve their country faced a double burden of discrimination. They confronted racism and sexism simultaneously, fighting battles on two fronts even before they put on a uniform. If you thought the challenges we've discussed so far were immense, the reality for women of color was exponentially harder. The United States military was segregated by law and practice during World War II. Black soldiers served in separate units, ate in separate mess halls, used separate facilities, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. This system of segregation extended to women's services. When the WAC was created in May 1942, African American leaders and civil rights organizations immediately pushed for Black women to be included. Eleanor Roosevelt supported their demands. The War Department agreed, but with restrictions. Black women could join, but only up to a quota matching their percentage of the general population, approximately 10%. In practice, the actual percentage was often lower. Black women who joined the WAC and later WAC trained at segregated facilities. At Fort Des Moines, they lived in separate barracks, ate at separate tables, and were organized into separate units. They faced hostility not just from society at large, but from white women in uniform alongside them. Job assignments reflected racial prejudice. Black WACs were disproportionately assigned to menial labor, cleaning, cooking, orderly work. They were promised training as medical technicians, but given jobs as hospital janitors. They were promised advancement, but faced glass ceilings based on race. In March 1945, 54 Black WACs at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, went on strike. They refused to report for duty in protest of discriminatory treatment, poor working conditions, and broken promises of training and advancement. For women continued the strike even under threat of court-martial. They were charged with disobeying orders and faced military justice. The Fort Devens strike was a courageous act of resistance against racial and gender discrimination within the military itself. Throughout the war, Black WACs documented their mistreatment. They wrote letters detailing segregated facilities, discriminatory assignments, and disrespectful treatment from white officers and enlisted personnel. They challenged the Army to live up to its stated principles of democracy while maintaining a Jim Crow system within its ranks. Their activism was part of the broader WWII campaign, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Despite these obstacles, Black women served with distinction. The most celebrated example was the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, known as the 688. This unit of 855 Black women, commanded by Major Charity Adams, was the only all-Black WAC unit sent overseas during World War II. Charity Adams Early was born December 5, 1918, in Kittrell, North Carolina. She graduated from Wilberforce University in 1938 with degrees in math and physics, then taught high school while pursuing graduate studies. When the WAC was created, she was among the first Black women to enlist. She became the first African American woman commissioned as an officer in the WAC. By war's end, she was a lieutenant colonel, the highest-ranking Black woman in the military. In February 1945, Adams and the 6,888th arrived in Birmingham, England. Their mission was to clear a massive backlog of undelivered mail. Millions of letters, packages, and parcels had piled up in warehouses, some sitting for years. Service members received no mail from home. Families received no letters from their sons and husbands overseas. The situation was devastating for morale. The 6888th's motto was "No mail, low morale." And this, right here, is the key insight. They understood that their work wasn't just sorting letters. It was connecting soldiers to home, maintaining emotional bonds across thousands of miles, keeping hope alive. They worked in 3 shifts, 8 hours each, 7 days a week. The warehouses were unheated. Rats infested the buildings. The sheer volume of mail was overwhelming. Many envelopes were damaged, addresses illegible. Some soldiers had been killed or transferred, requiring detective work to trace next of kin or current units. A general had predicted the job would take 6 months. The 6,888th cleared the backlog in 3 months. 3 months of round-the-clock work, handling millions of pieces of mail, reuniting service members with letters from home. They then moved to France and repeated their success in Rouen and Paris, clearing postal backlogs throughout the European theater. The women of the 6,888th faced racism in Europe as well as at home. They were subject to discriminatory treatment from white American soldiers, dealt with segregated facilities even overseas, and confronted attempts by some commanders to limit their movements and activities. Major Adams stood up to these challenges repeatedly, defending her soldiers and demanding respect for their service. In one famous incident, a white general attempted to take over command of the 6,888th and redistribute the battalion's personnel. Adams confronted him, saying that over her dead body would he take control of her women. The general backed down. Adams's courage and leadership became legendary among her soldiers. The 6,888th returned to the United States in March 1946 and was deactivated. The women went home to a still segregated country where their service was largely forgotten. For decades, their story was barely known outside their own community. In recent years, recognition has finally come. Fort Lee, Virginia, was renamed Fort Gregg Adams in 2023, becoming the first U.S. military base named for African Americans, honoring both Charity Adams Early and Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg. A monument to Adams was dedicated at the base in 2018. In 2024, a film titled The 6,888 told the battalion's story to a wider audience. Japanese American women faced their own unique form of discrimination. After Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and imprisoned in internment camps. They lost businesses, homes, possessions, freedom. All of this without trial, without charges, based solely on their ethnicity. Now, let's pause on that fact. We are not just talking about discrimination. We are talking about serving a nation that had actively imprisoned your family. Despite this betrayal, nearly 500 Japanese American women served in the military during World War II. They served in the Women's Army Corps, the Army Nurse Corps, and the Cadet Nurse Corps. Many enlisted directly from internment camps, leaving their families behind barbed wire to serve a country that had imprisoned them. Japanese American women were initially barred from the WAC when it was created in 1942. The Army Nurse Corps began accepting them in February 1943. The WAC began enlisting them in September 1943. Even then, recruitment was limited and scrutinized. 142 Japanese American women volunteered for the WAC. After basic training at Fort Des Moines or Fort Oglethorpe, they were assigned to various duties, most clerical. 48 were assigned to the Military Intelligence Service Language School, where they worked as translators of captured Japanese documents. This was highly sensitive work requiring security clearances, linguistic skills, and trust from a government that had imprisoned their families. Unlike Japanese American men who served in segregated combat units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, Japanese American women in the WAC were not segregated by race. They trained and served alongside women of all backgrounds. This integration was unusual for the era and represented a small but significant departure from standard military practice. At the end of the war, 11 Japanese-American WACs accepted assignments in Tokyo as part of the occupation forces. When they arrived, however, General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the occupation, refused to allow enlisted women to serve overseas in his command. He gave them a choice: return to the United States as WACs or stay in Japan as civilians. All 11 chose to remain in Japan and continued their work in civilian status. Approximately 350 Japanese-American women served in the Cadet Nurse Corps, a non-military program that provided free nursing education in exchange for service for the duration of the war. The program actively recruited from internment camps, offering women a chance to leave the camps and gain valuable training. The Cadet Nurse Corps had an official policy of non-discrimination, though many nursing schools still refused to admit Japanese-American students. The decision to serve for these women of color was complex and often painful. They were serving a country that discriminated against them, that denied them basic rights, that in some cases had imprisoned them. Yet they served anyway, motivated by patriotism, by a desire to prove their loyalty, by belief that service would advance the cause of civil rights, or simply by the opportunities military service offered for education, travel, and independence. What would you have done faced with that impossible choice? Their service was an act of faith in an America that didn't yet exist, an America that would live up to its ideals of equality. They were fighting not just the Axis powers, but for a vision of democracy that included them. Victory in Europe came May 8, 1945. Victory over Japan came August 15, 1945. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines would be coming home. And so would the women who had served alongside them. But what did home mean for over 350,000 women who had been transformed by military service? They'd learned skills, gained confidence, proved capabilities, experienced independence. They'd led units, operated complex equipment, made life-and-death decisions. They'd flown fighters, tended wounded, decoded secrets, commanded battalions. And what was the reward for this transformation? They were expected to simply return to the lives they'd left behind. Demobilization happened quickly. The massive military establishment that had grown to 16 million personnel at its peak needed to shrink back to peacetime levels. Women were among the first to be discharged. The justification was simple. They were temporary wartime measures, emergency solutions to emergency problems. The emergency was over. Some women were relieved. Military service had been demanding, stressful, often unpleasant. They'd done their duty and were glad to return to civilian life, to families, to the futures they'd postponed. Others were devastated. They'd found purpose, community, and careers in uniform. Discharge meant losing not just a job, but an identity and a way of life. The WASP program had already been disbanded in December 1944, months before the war ended. Over 1,000 women pilots returned to civilian life with no veteran status, no benefits, no official recognition of their service. Imagine that for a moment. You fly the most advanced aircraft in the world, and when the war ends, you're not even considered a veteran. Many tried to continue flying careers, but found civilian aviation largely closed to women. Airlines wouldn't hire female pilots. Flying schools wouldn't employ female instructors. The skills they developed and proven in military service were deemed irrelevant in peacetime. Other women's services began rapid drawdowns as soon as victory was declared. The WAC, WAVES, SPARS, and Marine Corps Women's Reserve all shrank dramatically in late 1945 and through 1946. Most women were discharged. A small number were retained on temporary status. The question became, would women have any permanent place in the peacetime military? Or was their service truly just a wartime expedient to be erased as quickly as possible? The debate in Congress and within the military was intense. Opponents argued that women had served admirably during the emergency, but that there was no need for them in a peacetime force. They argued that men returning from combat deserved military jobs and that women should step aside. They argued that women's proper place was in the home, as wives and mothers, and that encouraging military careers for women would undermine family and society. Supporters, including Generals Eisenhower and Marshall, argued from practical necessity. The military would still need personnel with skills that women had proven they could perform. Eliminating women from the military entirely would waste talent and capability. The war had demonstrated that women could serve effectively, and maintaining that option made strategic sense. Women veterans themselves lobbied hard. They'd served their country and proven themselves. They deserved the opportunity to continue serving if they chose. Organizations of women veterans formed, wrote letters, testified before Congress, and applied political pressure. The compromise that emerged was imperfect but significant. On June 12, 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. President Harry Truman signed it into law. For the first time in American history, women were authorized as permanent, regular members of the United States Armed Forces. But the Integration Act came with severe restrictions. And when you look at the details, these restrictions were staggering. Women could constitute no more than 2% of each service. They could not hold command over men. They could not serve in combat roles. They faced caps on rank, with promotion opportunities far more limited than for men. Married women with children under 18 could not enlist, and women who became pregnant would be automatically discharged. The law was progress, yes, but it codified inequality. Women were in the military, but as a separate, limited, lesser category. They had status, but not equal status. They had opportunities, but within carefully policed boundaries. For the WASPs, even this limited recognition didn't come. The 1948 law applied to the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Coast Guard, but it didn't grant military status to civilian wartime programs like the WASPs. These women would continue fighting for recognition for 3 more decades. The immediate post-war years were difficult for many women veterans. Society expected them to embrace domesticity eagerly. Popular culture celebrated the returning soldier settling down with a wife, buying a house in the suburbs, starting a family. Women who had been soldiers were expected to become wives. Women who had been pilots were expected to become mothers. Women who had commanded units were expected to command households. You can almost feel the intense cultural pressure to put everything back in its proper place. Many struggled with this transition. They'd tasted independence, responsibility, and achievement outside the domestic sphere. Returning to traditional gender roles felt like confinement after the relative freedom of military service. But cultural pressure was intense, and economic realities were stark. Women were pushed out of high-paying war industry jobs to make room for returning men. Professional opportunities contracted. The message was clear. The nation was grateful for women's wartime service, but that chapter was closed. Some women did continue military careers under the 1948 Integration Act. They faced ongoing discrimination, limited opportunities, and constant pressure to prove themselves. But they persisted, creating the foundation for future generations of military women. Others carried their military experience into civilian life. The skills they've learned, The confidence they'd gained, the networks they'd built, these continued to shape their lives. Many pursued higher education using the GI Bill, though women veterans received less support and encouragement than male veterans. Some entered professions that had been largely closed to women before the war. Some became advocates for women's rights, civil rights, and veterans' issues. The immediate legacy was mixed. Women had proven they could serve in the military, but society remained ambivalent about whether they should. They'd made enormous contributions to victory, but recognition was limited and grudging. They'd opened doors, but those doors were immediately narrowed with restrictions and quotas. It would take decades more struggle to fully recognize women's wartime service and to dismantle the barriers that limited their peacetime opportunities. But the foundation had been laid. 350,000 women had served. They'd flown 60 million miles, treated hundreds of thousands of wounded, decoded countless enemy messages, delivered millions of letters, and performed hundreds of thousands of jobs that kept the military functioning. They'd proved it could be done, and proof, once established, couldn't be erased. The date was June 12, 1948, almost 3 years after the war ended. In the Capitol, members of Congress prepared to vote on House Resolution 5989, a bill that would permanently alter the structure of the American military. The legislation had been debated for months, amended and re-amended, fought over in committees and on the floor. Now it was time for a decision. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act represented a fundamental shift in policy and philosophy. For the first time in American history, the law would authorize women to serve as regular, permanent members of the armed forces in peacetime, not as auxiliaries, not as temporary wartime measures, but as actual soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen with full military status. The path to this moment had been neither easy nor inevitable. When the war ended, most assumed women's military service would end with it. The emergency was over. Women had filled in admirably when needed, but surely now men would reclaim all military positions. That was the natural order. That was how things had always been. But here's what the planners in Washington were realizing. Reality intruded on assumptions. The United States emerged from World War II as a global superpower with global responsibilities. The military couldn't simply demobilize to pre-war levels and retreat into isolation. The Cold War was beginning. Tensions with the Soviet Union were rising. America needed to maintain substantial military forces, and those forces needed trained, capable personnel. General Eisenhower, now Army Chief of Staff, strongly supported permanent status for women. He'd seen firsthand during the war how effectively women performed military duties. He called their service essential to victory. Now he argued it was essential to maintaining a capable peacetime force. General Marshall, retired but still influential, agreed. So did leaders in the Navy, Marines, and the newly independent Air Force. The military brass made pragmatic arguments. Women had proved they could do the job. Maintaining a pool of trained women personnel provided flexibility and capability. Certain specialties, particularly in administration, communications, and medical services, benefited from continuity and experience that women could provide. Excluding women entirely would be wasteful and short-sighted. Women veterans and their advocates made moral arguments. These women had served their country in war. They'd earned the right to continue serving in peace. They'd proven their competence and loyalty. Denying them permanent status was both ungrateful and unjust. Opposition remained fierce. Some congressmen simply could not accept women as permanent fixtures in the military. They viewed women's wartime service as an unfortunate necessity, not a precedent. They worried about the effect on military culture, on unit cohesion, on the masculine identity of military service itself. They worried about families, about mothers in uniform, about children raised without proper maternal care. The debate revealed deep anxieties about gender roles in post-war America. The war had disrupted traditional patterns. Women had worked in factories, flown planes, worn uniforms, exercised authority. Now there was intense cultural pressure to return to pre-war normalcy, to reestablish clear boundaries between men's and women's spheres. The Integration Act challenged that restoration project. Compromise was essential to passage. The bill that finally came to a vote included numerous restrictions designed to limit women's roles and reassure skeptics. And this is where you see the true nature of the compromise. Women would be capped at 2% of each service's total strength. This quota ensured women would remain a small minority, unable to fundamentally alter military culture. Women would be barred from combat roles and from serving on combat vessels or combat aircraft. This preserved combat as an exclusively male domain and prevented women from accessing the experiences and assignments most valued for promotion to senior ranks. Women's promotion opportunities would be limited. Caps on the number of women who could hold certain ranks meant that even highly qualified women would face artificial barriers to advancement. Married women with children under 18 could not enlist. Women who became pregnant would be discharged. These provisions reflected assumptions that motherhood and military service were incompatible and that women's primary obligation was to family, not career. Women would have separate administrative structures within each service. They'd be led by female directors, but would have limited authority over male personnel. This segregation preserved male control of military hierarchy while giving women circumscribed space. These restrictions were significant limitations. The Integration Act wasn't equality. It was controlled, careful inclusion hedged around with protections against women gaining too much influence or disrupting military tradition too radically. But it was also real progress. Before this law, women had no legal standing as permanent military members. After it, they did. Before this law, women's military service could be terminated entirely at any moment. After it, women were established as part of the force structure. Before this law, women had no career path in the military. After it, limited though it was, a path existed. President Harry Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act into law on June 12, 1948. In his statement, he acknowledged women's contributions during the war and expressed confidence in their continued service. He didn't mention the restrictions and limitations embedded in the law, but everyone involved understood them clearly. And this is the reality of historical progress, isn't it? It's almost never a clean, total victory. It's often a messy, negotiated compromise. In the immediate aftermath, each service began implementing the new law. Women were recruited and commissioned as regular personnel. Officer training programs were established. Career paths were defined within the strict boundaries the law imposed. The numbers remained small. The 2% cap meant that even at maximum strength, women would be a tiny fraction of total forces. But those women who did serve created precedents, gained experience, and prepared the ground for future expansion. The 1948 Integration Act was a victory, but an incomplete one. It was a door opened a crack, not thrown wide. It was permission to exist in the military, not invitation to full partnership. It was recognition that women could serve, accompanied by insistence that they do so only on carefully limited terms. For women who had served in World War II, the Integration Act was bittersweet. It validated what they'd done and proved. It created opportunities that hadn't existed before. But it also codified inequality, enshrining in law the principle that women were lesser members of the military community. The fight for equal treatment would continue for decades. Combat exclusions wouldn't be fully lifted until the 21st century. Quotas and caps would gradually be eliminated. Pregnancy policies would be reformed. Barriers would fall slowly, grudgingly, one by one. But June 12, 1948, remained a turning point. On that date, women's place in the American military became permanent. The foundation laid during World War II became the structure on which future generations would build. The experiment that began in desperation in 1942 became established policy in 1948. And once established, it could be expanded. So how did 350,000 American women transform the legendary United States military in World War II? The answer lies not in any single dramatic moment, but in the cumulative weight of over 200,000 jobs performed, 60 million miles flown, millions of messages decoded, hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers treated, and countless acts of courage, confidence, and dedication repeated day after day for the duration of the war. The transformation began with necessity. Pearl Harbor created an immediate, undeniable need for more military personnel than traditional sources could provide. General Marshall and other military leaders recognized that excluding half the population from service was a luxury America could no longer afford in total war. That recognition forced a door open that had been locked for centuries. Women walked through that door in astonishing numbers. Over 150,000 in the WAC, 100,000 in Waves, 23,000 in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, 13,000 in SPARS, 68,000 nurses in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, over 1,000 as pilots in the WASP, and thousands more in supporting roles. They came from every state, every background, every walk of life. They volunteered knowing they'd face discrimination, knowing they'd have to work harder than men to be taken seriously, knowing society might judge them harshly for stepping outside traditional roles. They came anyway. It's a level of dedication that is truly remarkable when you consider the hostility they faced. The transformation continued with performance. Women didn't just fill positions. They excelled in them. They learned faster, made fewer errors, showed up more consistently. They mastered technical skills that skeptics had insisted were beyond female capability. They handled stress, danger, and pressure with the same competence men did. General Eisenhower didn't call women's service essential to victory out of politeness. He said it because it was true. And that, right there, is perhaps the most crucial evidence of the entire transformation. Without women's contributions, the D-Day invasion would have been significantly harder, possibly impossible. Without women pilots ferrying aircraft, training gunners, and testing planes, the Army Air Forces would have been crippled. Without women cryptographers, the intelligence advantage that helped win the war would have been diminished. Without women nurses, the mortality rate for wounded soldiers would have been far higher. The transformation manifested in changing attitudes. Commanders who had initially resisted women in their units became advocates after seeing their performance. General MacArthur went from skeptic to supporter. General Patton acknowledged women's essential contributions. Marine Commandant Holcomb calculated that women Marines freed enough men to form 3 new divisions. These weren't men predisposed to support women's rights. They were hardened military leaders focused on winning a war. They changed their minds because evidence forced them to. The transformation extended beyond the military into American society. Women in uniform became visible, undeniable facts of wartime life. Recruiting posters showed them in crisp uniforms. Newsreels featured them working on aircraft, marching in formation, serving overseas. Popular culture both celebrated and struggled with these images. The figure of Rosie the Riveter, muscular and competent in her factory overalls, became an icon. "We can do it," the poster proclaimed, and women in and out of uniform were proving it daily. You know the iconic poster, "We Can Do It"? That image wasn't just propaganda, it was reflecting a seismic shift happening in real time. This visibility challenged deep assumptions about gender and capability. If women could fly fighters and operate radio equipment and work as mechanics, what else could they do? If women could serve overseas in combat zones, if they could lead units and make life or death decisions, what justification remained for excluding them from voting, from professions, from equal participation in public life? World War II didn't answer these questions definitively. American society would spend decades working through the implications. But the questions became unavoidable. The transformation was especially significant for future generations of military women. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948 created permanent space for women in the military. That space was small, restricted, and hemmed with limitations. But it existed. Women who served in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s built on the foundation World War II women established. Each generation pushed boundaries a little further, challenged restrictions a little more forcefully, demanded equality a little more insistently. Combat exclusions began to erode in the 1990s. Women flew combat missions in the Gulf War. The 2% cap was eliminated. Rank limitations were removed. Pregnancy policies were reformed. In 2015, all combat positions in the military were opened to women who could meet the standards. In 2016, the first women graduated from Army Ranger School. Today, women serve in every role, at every rank, in every branch of the United States military. None of that would have been possible without the 350,000 who served in World War II. They were pioneers who proved it could be done. They were trailblazers who created paths others could follow. They were warriors who fought enemies abroad and prejudice at home. The cost was real. 38 WASPs died in service. 16 nurses were killed by enemy action. 432 service women total gave their lives. 88 were taken prisoner. Thousands more carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. All of them faced discrimination, harassment, and hostility that male veterans never experienced. The recognition was slow in coming. WASPs didn't receive veteran status until 1977, 33 years after their service ended. They didn't receive the Congressional Gold Medal until 2009, 65 years later. The 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion story was barely known outside their community for decades. Fort Gregg Adams wasn't renamed to honor Charity Adams early until 2023, 78 years after the war ended. 78 years. Just let that number sink in for a moment. The recognition was slow, but the legacy was undeniable. But the legacy endures. Every woman who wears an American military uniform today walks a path carved out by World War II pioneers. Every female general officer stands on the shoulders of Oveta Culpabi and Charity Adams Early. Every woman who flies military aircraft honors the memory of the WASPs. Every woman who serves in combat pays tribute to the nurses who worked under fire in field hospitals. The transformation wasn't complete, immediate, or universally welcomed. But it was real and irreversible. 350,000 women proved that military service wasn't defined by gender, but by capability, courage, and commitment. They proved that women could serve their country in uniform as effectively as men. They proved that the military could be stronger, more capable, and more successful by including rather than excluding half the population. That proof, established in the crucible of the largest war in human history, transformed not just the military, but American society's understanding of what women could do and be. The legendary United States military that emerged from World War II was legendary in part because it had learned to harness all of America's talent and potential, regardless of gender. That lesson, hard-won and fiercely contested, remains one of the war's most important legacies. The women who served in World War II didn't just support the war effort. They didn't just fill temporary gaps. They transformed an institution, challenged a society, and opened futures that previous generations could barely imagine. They did it not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through daily confidence, persistent courage, and unwavering dedication to serving a country that didn't always value their service. How did 350,000 American women transform the legendary United States military in World War II? They showed up. They did the work. They proved themselves. And they refused to be erased. That was the transformation. That was the legacy. That was how history changed.